Okay, so thank you so much for joining this morning. I've got some microphones up here. We are going to be doing a workshop today on navigating online risks and digital harms. I'm Trish Audette-Longo. I'm an assistant professor at Carleton University in Ottawa. And essentially our plan for today is we're going to do a little bit of background work, what is happening, particularly in the landscape in this country, and then we're going to do a workshop with some different scenarios. How would you respond to different kinds of risks that could come up for you and for your colleagues? The idea really is that as much as journalists feel alone at the moment that they're kind of under fire from different kinds of online harm and different kinds of digital risks, they are not. And so how can we actually be better colleagues? How can we support each other? How can we find ways to kind of navigate through? Then we're going to have some time for discussion. So you'll be working on scenarios together. Then we're going to come back as a bigger group and talk about those scenarios. What are some takeaways? What are some tips, right? Every different newsroom has different practices, so what can we learn from each other? And then there are some takeaways, including more of a checklist of things to do on your own and some additional resources that exist already. So in terms of my background, I grew up in a few different newsrooms, including the Edmonton Journal, and worked at National Observer. I was one of the early adopters of things like Twitter, which felt very hopeful and positive in 2007 and 2008. And perhaps these days, with different names and different things, doesn't feel so hopeful and positive. But this sort of research project, or this project, came out of the trucker convoy that happened in Ottawa and in many border crossings across this country. So you might be familiar with the groups that were anti-vaccination that wanted to see a significant change in public policy in Canada and elsewhere. In Ottawa, they sort of collected on Parliament Hill and using the trucks managed to camp out for 3 weeks. On the air in Canada, we saw journalists being attacked. So we saw journalists having things thrown at them. We saw them shoved toward their cameras, away from their cameras. We saw them yelled at as they were delivering live reports. And also behind the scenes, what we weren't necessarily seeing was just an onslaught of kind of constant, different kinds of attacks and harassment. So this is part of a bigger project that I'm doing at Carleton, which is sort of how do we navigate risk in the journalism classroom? How do we teach students how to navigate risk? How do we teach them how to sort of lock down when they start to receive these onslaughts of harassment? How do we ensure that they don't feel like they are by themselves? And part of this is also transferable to newsrooms right now. So what we know that journalists need more resources to protect themselves, both from being doxxed and from the trauma that receiving online harassment causes. And doxxed is that sort of targeted effort to find people's personal information and then turn around and share it online in order for other people to find them, to track them down, to go to their homes. We know that online harassment of journalists in Canada is on the rise, but onslaughts of abusive online messages are the norm for racialized journalists in Canada. In 2021, Matthew Pearson and David Seglins did a survey of 1,200 journalists in Canada. 56% said that they had been harassed or threatened in the previous 4 years. The rates of online harassment and violence were reported particularly high among Arab, Asian, and Black media workers. It was most prevalent among non-binary and trans people, and women journalists were reporting experiencing harassment more often than men. Younger journalists, so folks who are aged 21 to 29, were the most likely to report that they had experienced online harassment. So these are all just of note as we go forward. So what do we do with this information? It is also notable that the Coalition for Women in Journalism in 2022 documented at least 13 major organized troll campaigns against women journalists in Canada alone, accounting for an alarming 52% of the total global online harassment cases in the world. And this is not new, although the sense sometimes is that this has just started to arise in the last couple of years. In 2018, the International Women's Media Foundation found that nearly 1/3 of women journalists had considered leaving their profession altogether due to the sort of amount and tenor of online attacks and threats. So this is kind of the background that we are working with. My goal is for people not to be leaving the field because of online harassment and threats, and so we're working together today on a few different scenarios in order to assess what the risks are, to talk about how we might prevent them, and to think about how we might respond. So this is where I kind of jump away from this microphone and from this podium here, but essentially, I'm going to be sharing scenarios with you and asking you to work through them in groups. We're going to take about half an hour to kind of talk through what would you do for the 3 different scenarios. How would you assess them? How would you prevent them? How would you respond to them? And so you're kind of pooling the knowledge that you already have in order to talk about what you would do next. Every group is going to have different scenarios. So when we come back together, you're going to actually have a chance to read out that scenario, talk through what you would do or what you decided to do as a group, and how you might carry that into newsrooms in the future. What I love about doing this in this kind of setting is that we aren't all working from the same sort of protocols, right? Every newsroom might have protocols. We're working across different ones, and that's where we might actually learn something from each other. So if you're not already at a table that has some stickies at it, please join a table, and I'm just going to come around and bring these scenarios.
Okay, so we're gonna come back together. Which group would like to go first to read out your scenario? Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, just so we can all hear. Okay, so you're reading out your scenario, and then you're telling us a little bit about how you assess the risk to either the journalist or your colleagues, what you thought about in terms of response to this scenario, and then how we might prevent it in the future. There are so much preventative. Okay, so this is a short one. You are covering a press conference on Parliament Hill, led by the finance minister live on Twitter. Your tweets are focused on what they are saying, but replies to and quote tweets of your posts take an abusive turn. As other users mock the minister's voice, clothing, and family, how do you respond? So I think we assess that um, we didn't get a sense that the responses, the tweets, were a safety concern. No one's personal being was being threatened. Yes, also directed at the politician, not the reporter. So we thought we would not respond. That would be the best response. And just kind of monitoring to see how it went from there. The commentary is aimed at the political figure, so there's not really anything the reporter needs to do, and so just letting it monitoring, but continuing to just watch. Yeah, because this kind of sounds like a daily occurrence. Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. And there's I'm curious if everyone has questions about it, because it's a daily occurrence. Can you turn off replies to it? You can turn off replies to a tweet. Yeah, that's one option. If you feel like it's just going to be too much, you can turn off replies altogether. You could check whether or not you could consider whether or not you are tagging the minister in. It doesn't make clear that you tagged in the minister, so is the minister also getting this? Yep. So my colleague who was with me made a comment because this troll account, had followers and such, reposted some of my content with some of his racist hate. And she said, well, that's something you should block because he's using your content to further what, his cause is what he's trying to do. And so at that point, I was like, well, maybe I should then. It's one thing for him to comment and I ignore it, but if he's reposting my comment or my content and then using that to, further, then I think that in that instance, I would. What are your thoughts? Anybody's thoughts? Yeah, I'm curious if anyone else would start blocking. Yeah.
Kind of lose that privilege to comment or even be active on the page.
Yeah, so there's blocking. That is part of this. There's definitely turning off replies. Um, and then there is the question of like, is this how you want to spend your day? Like, do you want to spend your day sort of monitoring this and blocking everything, or can you just kind of let it, just keep an eye on it, but not necessarily respond to every single one, assessing the risk, and the risk perhaps is minimal in this case. Right, thank you. Who'd like to go next? You have the microphone. I gave you the microphone. I'm sorry.
This one is you reach out to the office of a prominent political leader for an interview and are told instead of to email your questions. You send 3 questions framed as themes that you hope to discuss in an interview this week along with your contact information. Instead of coordinating an interview, the political leader's team cuts and pastes the questions into a press release issued to illustrate your news outlet's agenda. While the online press release does not contain your name or contact info, someone shares the press release as an Instagram story and tags your personal Instagram account. Nasty messages quickly multiply in your inbox while other users keep resharing the story day after day. How do you respond? Uh, One thing we discuss is you reach out to the political leaders team because there's a relationship there that is going to be in need of repair and trust rebuilt because this wasn't the intent of your email. And then discussion with you, we decided that it'd probably be best to probably have either the reporters shut down their account or hand over their account to somebody else on the team. That way they can monitor messages and report what needs to be reported if there's any threatening messages there, and then have them revisit their security settings on their personal account to see if there's anything that they could do to prevent receiving messages from the outside people um, whenever it's a private account and that's not the purpose of the account.
Has sent out really just themes that they'd like to talk about, and the politician has used that for a press release. And now they're just getting this onslaught of harassment and complaints. Like, just make it public, like kind of like turn it.
We just ask these questions. Why are they not
Thank
answering?
you.
Answer the questions.
Right.
I mean, turn it back on them.
Turn it back on them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's probably put into that, but
You're kind of out of
trying to ask a question.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you use the same platform, or what platform would you use to sort of turn it back around? I'm just kind of curious.
Yes, I would use the same if that's where the discussion.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, it's really what.
So like if they've sort of started this on Twitter or X or whatever, then stay on that. Would you use the Instagram side of things, where they've kind of come after the reporter?
I would add Instagram too. Again, that's where
Like a separate.
accounts are where conversations.
Okay. Another option that comes up sometimes is the idea of the editorial, like the editorial where you come back to your own platform and use that. It's interesting though, the question too of like, how do you rebuild this relationship though? Like something has gone completely off. So what do we do with that? Anything else you'd do for the reporter? Anything else you'd be concerned about for the reporter?
I'll just say so I work for the New York Times, and we have found that the cutbacks at Twitter or X, one of
Our scenario is it's Saturday morning and you have been asked to cover the assignment desk. One of your colleagues calls you uncertain whether it's safe to come to work today. They shared clips from a recent story online. They were retweeted by someone with a large following who was critical of the story. Abusive replies, retweets, and quote tweets quickly multiply, and other users have surfaced and shared your colleague's home address and phone number online. What steps can you take to support your colleague? Does anyone want to talk about our assessment?
For the assessment, we just kind of use the same description, and just the colleague has a lot of fear on board. Their info's been doxxed, and that's the situation. Respond. So, not feeling safe to come in. Of course, you concede whatever makes them comfortable. Their home address has been doxed, so staying home, like that's actually not really a safe place in this situation. So we talked about identifying a place where they would feel safe. Not at work. They're not in the right mind space to do work. And their address has been compromised, so maybe a hotel or something like that. Then we talked about reaching out to the main sharer, the person that was critical, about taking it down, or maybe even putting out something about no threats. Maybe if the person's critical, that's one thing, but just appealing to their humanity about, oh, this person's now not safe. So we think a reasonable person, would support the safety of the journalist. Some of the stuff we've already heard, blocking the account or reporting the tweets, and also engaging the team to support this person's work and report the accounts that are malicious, and then also monitoring how often people are responding, seeing if it's going down, maybe calming down or not, just how active it is could have a lot to do with your actions. Chris, would you like to talk about prevention?
So we, again, similarly to the last scenario, we talked about raising awareness of online risks for staff and letting them know that they don't need to engage in online and social platforms for their work. Reminding staff of the privacy options and settings on various platforms, and also encouraging staff to promote content through corporate accounts rather than personal accounts that could be subject to doxing and personal harassment.
Any questions? Anything people would add to this one? This is the one where you're an editor for the day. Maybe not always, but you're an editor today, and your person probably can't come into work today. So I like how you nailed the question of, would they feel safer at home? Would they feel safer at a third location that no one knows about? Which is a big one to ask from the get-go. Where are they at right now? And how are they? Anything people would add?
As far as the doxing attack goes, of course, this is a scenario where that's already happened. But to protect other colleagues that hasn't happened yet, going through a delisting service would help sort of minimize the online footprint of like where their home address would be online. And there's a few of them out there now. We use Delete Me over at Freedom of the Press Foundation, so every staff member is just automatically sort of like added to it.
So one of the things we're going to leave with today is a bit of a self-doxing checklist. So a series of questions to ask about where you're at in terms of what information is public. So you'll be leaving with that, as well as some other resources. But Delete Me is a resource that I'm not as familiar with. So does your team want to share one of your scenarios?
Yeah, sure. So do y'all want to do the whistleblower one or the B-roll? Okay, cool. So in this case, we have a scenario. You're meeting a well-placed source who was willing to blow the whistle on a government platform that has gone sideways. They want to be interviewed, show you documents, provide you with phone numbers for other sources, and stay in touch if you have further questions. But they are not willing to be identified in the stories. Having their name or position published will put their own job at risk, as well as the livelihoods of many people close to them. You and your editor discuss the pros and cons of starting an investigation with an unnamed source and decide to agree to the terms. All interviews are on the record. You can quote them, but you will do everything in your power to protect their identity. From a digital security perspective, how can you approach this? And there's like a few moving parts to addressing a lot of that. Part of which I feel like starts with a good tips page, meaning like people on your website, on your other like ways that you sort of present yourself to the world, have like a list of sort of like apps or methods to contact you, whether that's through Signal, WhatsApp, postal mail, so just like literally physical mail. Yeah, basically having that so that that first contact where they first reach out to you is through a platform that would leave very little trace, like digital trace of that contact happening. Let's see. And then I don't know if you'd like to talk about sort of the process of maybe if we wanted to like go ultra secure, not necessarily like receiving docs, but just looking at them.
Yeah, first, I mean, David just gave kind of a masterclass of what you would want to do to receive kind of that first contact. The other thing that sometimes you see at the highest levels of a story like this is to minimize, to kind of continue that philosophy of minimizing your digital footprint. How many things can you do via analog? How can you transmit that same information without any documents even changing hands? So maybe you just look at the documents and then describe them to your audience. Maybe your source describes the documents to you. Our lawyers will tell us that even the best way is to see if you can replicate the same information through court records and other protected documents versus any kind of unprotected. So sometimes you'll find out information and then instead of just running with it, you go and you are looking at court cases and tax documents and documents that are protected by the courts so that you are not relying on kind of this initial documentation that you receive. That's another best practice.
Cool, thanks. And as far as like receiving docs and how that happens, there's a few different sort of methods that people have successfully used in the past, including sending it through, physical mail to leave as little digital trace as possible and involve as little third parties as possible. The other thing is also using an end-to-end encrypted app like Signal, for example, which sort of protects the contents of that with encryption, but then will also basically delete even the encrypted sort of like documents after it traverses through their system and reaches the recipient, which is very useful because it also leaves a minimal amount of metadata, so to speak, or data about data. So there is, in this case with Signal, no record once those documents are received of that transaction happening and who the to and from were, which is pretty nice. And then, of course, for total, situations of total network surveillance, Secure Drop is another way to have a way for people to send you documents in a way that is network anonymous as well. Yep.
In terms of overall assessment, we know that different stories carry different risks, right? So even before the story goes out into the world, what kinds of risks are there? If we think through these particular scenarios, what else could happen? Some of these scenarios really were things that were unexpected. A politician asks you to send them questions ahead of time, you send them themes, suddenly you're the target of online harassment. Hard to assess, but are there things that you can do that are preventative ahead of time? You are most at risk of an online attack after publishing a story. So in terms of minimization, completing a risk assessment form before reporting, talking through risks, finding out if there's things that you already have in place that can help you minimize risk. This is the Committee to Protect Journalists. They actually have a full risk assessment form for almost anything you could think of, for going out into the field in many different ways and also going through different kinds of online harassment and how to respond. We've talked about doxing, and just to differentiate it from what we often do, which is we try to find as much information as we can about people so that we can reach them and ask them questions. But we are not using that information so that we can go to their house or send a bunch of other people to their house, right? So it's just a completely different kind of risk that doxing exposes us to. The New York Times has a full doxing curriculum guide. And so one of the links that you'll have here is to one for yourself. But the things you're kind of looking for, are your phone numbers available? Are other kinds of home addresses or past home addresses available? Names of family members, birth dates, these are the kinds of things that you're looking out for to make sure that they're not online. And why to do it? Because we do operate online to some extent in some ways. Even if we're thinking that we're not really doing, we're not doing Twitter, we're not doing Threads, we're using the corporate accounts as opposed to being engaged. We are in some ways using online materials. And so this is just a way to get an awareness of what is online about you now, what you can do with that. I'm going to pass around the checklist. I'm just going to suggest doing this with someone else, or also thinking about ways to do this where you already feel safe, right? Because it can be actually quite jarring to find out that your personal information is out there. The benefit of doing this with someone else that you trust too is that they just have a completely different search engine than you do. They have totally different algorithms. They're not maybe constantly searching your name if that's something that you do, so they're going to come across different things than you would. And the other thing I just wanted to point out, this is from colleagues over at TMU and JSource and Canadian Association of Journalists, and also NAJA is a partner on this, but this is a press freedom project where folks are reporting threats to press freedom here in Canada. There is one in the United States as well. What's also really useful about this site is in submitting an incident or in the About page, there's actually some quick resources for how to ensure that you're not just emailing in experiences of being harassed or emailing in threats, because they're actually asking you to already start to think about what the security is on that and what's the footprint on that. So some of those tools we just talked about in terms of protecting your source, you can use those too. So just kind of a good kind of roundup. So I'm going to pass these out, and then that's kind of it for today. I really appreciate you coming and talking through this. I'm here if you have more questions, but thank you so much. Thank you.